Bomb Jack is a 1984 single-screen platformer by Techmo, a superb and brightly coloured arcade game with some of the most cheery music you'll hear from a game in this genre, especially if you happens to be a Beatles fan with its sound of Lady Madonna. The premise of the game is to simply jump and glide around each stage and collect bombs. It's essentially a point-scoring game, and of course games of this age were generally about gaining huge sums of points to get you the best score against your friends. It's one of the best platformers of the 1980s and without a doubt a massive success too. I've had tons of people asking me to cover this one for a little while now because it truly is that well loved. So in traditional format of this ports ranking series, we are going to start with the worst and gradually work to the best. If you are new to this series, I'll leave my arcade ports playlist pinned in the comments section so you can catch up. The Bomb Jack released for the Commodore Plus 4 and Commodore 16 is fairly bare bones and a little wooden to control if I'm honest. There is no music, but a couple of rudimentary sound effects, which doesn't really resemble an arcade sound as such. It released in 1986 by Elite. Arcade conversions for the Plus 4 and 16 were in their minority really, but to be frank, it's not a terribly awful conversion, just very limited to what it can and can't do. For example, in the arcades game, we'll frequently see things to collect on screen, things flashing and other bits and pieces. What you see here is pretty much what you get. There has been much worse for Commodore Plus 4 and the Commodore 16 machines, Ghosts and Goblins for example, which I've covered in the past. For a very basic version of Bomb Jack, it's kind of fun to play. One thing that I did notice, which was a little bit annoying, was jumping through gaps. I will also mention that most other versions, just like the 1984 arcade game, had a change of backgrounds per stage. Not with this version though. Like I say, it was kind of wooden to control jack from time to time, but like I say, not really a bad conversion at all, just extremely basic. I had high hopes for the Commodore 64 conversion. A lifelong C64 fan cannot be biased though, and I never am in these videos, but I am ranking this port so low down in the list because at the core of it, it just isn't really that great. Firstly, the gameplay screen isn't right. By that I mean the sprites and the enemies just seem way too big, and many times playing this I found that jumping over enemies can normally cause an instant death, where there isn't much room to jump over them. It is very pixelated too, admittedly. The music isn't too bad, but doesn't really resemble the source material too greatly. A real shame with this version, it is just overly clunky to play, and at times I even found that platforms kind of merged in with the background colours far too often, which caused a few deaths too. This ZX Spectrum 1986 conversion is a damn fine one. Yes, it is a ZX Spectrum game and its colours aren't for everybody's taste, but considering everything else here with the gameplay and layout of the stages, this is where the Spectrum excels ahead of its main 8-bit counterparts, i.e. the Commodore 64. This is a very roomy game, which means it isn't too cramped and can generally have a good time with this conversion. It has no music and sound effects are pretty basic. But push those aside, not every conversion had music anyways, and if it did, it wasn't really copying the music of the arcade game, with just a couple exceptions in this video. This was a lot of fun to play and felt like a real high quality Spectrum game considering the release of this title too. It's fairly impressive with its use of physics when jumping and landing. The Amstrad CPC was a fairly good conversion of Bomb Jack released back in 1986. It plays really nicely and has good controls. For example, when I am pressing fire button, Jack slowly guides downwards, and it feels like it was nicely done here too with the gliding aspect of things. We have all the usual stuff here, such as invincibility collectibles and changes of background. The game itself is fairly colourful too. I have seen some really shoddy Amstrad conversions during this series, and Bombjack really does a fantastic job on the Amstrad CPC. One thing that it doesn't have is music, but we do have sound effects, and those are pretty high standards too, really. Sure, the text on the right hand side is kind of pixelated, but that's acceptable to some extent given its age and the hardware. I would have thought Amstrad users who only had a green screen at the time would have been really annoyed to realise how nicely coloured this conversion was. Sprite collision detection is pretty spot on here too. Not many of you were likely expecting a mere original Game Boy conversion to be this high up, but here we are. And you know what? This version is pretty damn good too. This conversion released in 1992 by Infogrames and does everything right, apart from the monochrome colours of course. But that aside, everything else is really here. The gameplay area is nicely spread out, which allows us room to jump around the screen without danger of accidentally bumping into enemies. The pace of the game is amazingly good. It is fairly speedy in terms of sprites. As for the sprites themselves, they are excellently drawn, and it just generally felt like a good solid port all round. Yes, the music isn't right either, but we do get changes of background which adds to the experience, like we are actually getting further into the game itself. You can even choose to enable music with this too, so your parents can complain too much for that repeating 8-bit sound loop. Firstly, remember what you see here is emulation, and from time to time games appear to run slightly higher speeds, and that's what has happened here with the Amiga's conversion of Bombjack using WinUAE. This conversion is known to play slow. Its version I used to play back in the day is not absolutely terrible, but it's playable. It is originally just slow in terms of movement though, but I always found it acceptable to play back then. It certainly looks the part with its colours and backdrops, but I can guarantee you the next platform is light years ahead of this. There is a remake of this game for Amiga which has cleaned it up. I won't mention or rank it here, but we'll be showcasing it in my unofficial arcade port sub-series at some point soon. Now, the strange thing with the 1985 NEC PC 88 conversion by SoftBank Corp is that it sounds so damn good. By far best sounding version here, which sounds next best to the arcade game itself. It does music and sound effects proud without a doubt. The game itself is colourful and certainly playable, but it does suffer with sprite flicker with Jack himself. Like I say, it is absolutely playable, but not as fluid as some conversions in this video. I rated this one so highly because it looks great and it certainly plays well, providing you get along with slower paced games. I think this is a great port, but could likely be a controversial place to put this one in this video. You likely weren't expecting to see a Sega SG-1000 game this high up in this video, but damn, this is one awesome port. Now, admittedly, we don't have the vertical and centralized ratio here, but neither does most other versions, if I'm honest. What is it about this conversion which is actually so good? Well, firstly, unlike most ports in this video, the music is actually almost there with this version. It's not perfect by any stretch, and I obviously think the NEC PC 88 did the best job of that. I am guessing at this point that the Beatles music couldn't be produced for copyright reasons, and that's just it, I guess. The Sega SG-1000 version plays so nicely and just feels really fun whilst playing it. And in first place, we have the Atari ST conversion. Now, I love this version of Bomb Jack on the Atari ST. Not the gameplay as much as the music, which is just amazing. It's the first time I've ever played this version, and the music is just so nicely done, and likely one of the best tunes I've ever heard on the Atari ST. Firstly, it skews the gameplay footage. At this point, my controller was going a little bit mental. I have looked this up to see if this was an issue with the game itself, but no reports, so it was quite likely my controller. So as we can see, the game looks fantastic, especially those colours, and the sound effects are really nicely done here too. This 1988 port hasn't really got much bad to say about it. It plays relatively really well. The original arcade game is a complete vertical screen centralised, so if there was any criticism, this would be it. But to be fair, every version of this video hasn't had that true arcade gameplay ratio size. And that's it for today's ranking the Bomb Jack port. So as always, let me know in the comments which version you grew up with, and do you necessarily agree that Atari ST deserved to be in first place just here, or would you have rather had the Commodore Amiga version in first place? And as always, until next time, thanks for watching.